the C, regulations, and again, this is just in the agriculture section, or not just, but before we get to aquaculture language. So the new regulation proposed is to say that farming and management of food fish, finfish, shellfish, or other aquatic plant or animal products shall be subject to the aquaculture policies and regulations, Article 8, Section 2 of this program. So again, just further clarifying. Okay?
Okay.
Okay. So then we do indeed get into Article 8.2, the aquaculture section. Policies A, 1, and 2 are there, but no changes have been proposed.
So shall we turn to Commissioner Johnson's?
Sure.
Well,
I
it
don't
might
know.
be easier to do the ones you can agree on first. See if there's low-lying fruit within this topic.
Within this.
Low-hanging fruit, I mean.
Okay. So if we go to the top of page 9 there, same with items 3, these are policies, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 have no changes proposed.
Okay.
Which brings us to
Right.
policy 8, and this is again, this is consistent with the definition change we just discussed earlier. So the policy would read that experimental forms of aquaculture involving the use of new species, new growing methods, or new harvesting techniques should be allowed when they are consistent with applicable state and federal regulations and this program. Experimental forms of finfish aquaculture use and development in water bodies should be limited in scale and may be allowed for a limited period of time to allow for evaluation and adaptive management as needed. So it's essentially calling out a subset of any kind of experimental aquaculture.
No, I know, Phil, that I think you made a blanket statement about not wanting to approve anything mentioning finfish, but this, for this number 8, I think what's important is that they should be allowed if they're consistent with the regulations and this program. So if this program, makes it impossible, then there would really be no, I think there would be limited concern about adopting this number 8.
Well, yeah, we can just move along and put all this together.
Is this similar to what Whatcom County has done, though, allowing salmon enhancement temporary fish
It
operations?
just wouldn't be the
No, that's-
category for that.
Yeah, those are separate.
That's
That's gonna be
separate.
separate. Yeah, that's restoration enhancement. This is talking about experimental, so
Yeah,
new techniques, new species, that sort of thing. So yeah, if the board opts to go with a prohibition, then certainly that proposed added text could just be dropped out. Okay.
So number 8 does get into Commissioner Johnson's previous statement about what, I mean, obviously 13 does.
Yeah, I mean, so no changes proposed in 9. 10 is simply striking that language because of, let's see, it's tricky, we gotta flip back and forth.
The board approves of number 8, I guess I'm a little confused about that.
It sounds like they're not yet.
yeah, it's
approved.
approved.
Not yet?
Not yet.
Right, so that's.
It's kind of opening up this discussion about Whatcom and net pens.
So we're gonna hold that for the whole finfish.
Which really is where the board needs to show their cards so we know what direction, because it's going to influence the dialogue here.
Right.
Right, and some of, I think what we had mentioned earlier, that some of the proposed revisions to the aquaculture section are not only specific to finfish, so that's where we might kind of tick off, as you said, David, some of the low-hanging fruit within the world of aquaculture. Just depends on the board's preference of how to proceed.
Well, it looks like we may be at a point where we're either going to have put forward an outright ban based upon, and then believe that it may pass, that it may be accepted by DOE, you know, based on some of the conversations that you've had, Bill.
Well, it may not be passed, but they said that, you know, they would consider it. They brought it forward earlier, you know, as an option. And, you know, well, I'll get into some of this other stuff later, but there's substantial science, it seems to me, that I've been collected and that I've collected, showing that it's not particularly the healthiest way to go. And even NOAA itself, when it was asked by the Department of Commerce to come up with a report about finfish aquaculture, you know, and because we're at a $14 billion deficit currently in seafood. And in the report, the beginning of the report, it says, from NOAA, is environmental challenges posed by aquaculture depending upon the type, scope, and location of aquaculture activity may include nutrient and chemical waste, water use, demands, aquatic animal diseases and invasive species, potential competitive and genetic effects on wild species, effect on endangered or protected species, effect on protected and sensitive marine areas, effect on habitat and other species, and use of forage fish for aquaculture feed. This is from NOAA in 2011 in their report recommending aquaculture. This is basically the way it starts out. You know, I mean, they're sitting there admitting that there's all these potential problems still. And it comes up in several of NOAA's reports. So that, along with a lot of science, a lot of reading that I've done.
So anyway, one way would be to have this absolute prohibition, and the other way would be to look at the restrictions that our ordinance would have that would address those concerns.
And just, you know, I'd like to just be clear that upland aquaculture, I would be in favor of it. It would create a water-dependent use like the RCW requires.
Right. But just as an example, on page 11 of 31, one of the concerns that's been raised is that if we had aquaculture, say in front of the mill, if we had finfish aquaculture in front of the mill, a number of organizations have noted, including I think our own Marine Science Center, that is an area that is used for migration for fish. And
It's a eelgrass path for migration.
Right. So
Right.
on page 11 of 31, this would be an example of something that would keep, this would be something in which the administrator would not permit.
And where on 11:31?
That would be the last one, number
The
8.
last one.
Well, that,
The finfish facilities would have to be 1,500 feet or more in such areas.
What is such area?
okay, because the area has been identified as critical feeding or migration area, okay.
Critical feeding or migration.
Yeah, and that's what's important to remember is when you look at the map in terms of just the designation allowances, you know, high intensity, or excuse me, aquatic when adjacent to high intensity, that's obviously not the only criteria. It's only there if and when you can meet all the other provisions.
And I'm surprised that that number 8 doesn't have migration areas for birds and mammals. I think it would also have birds, marine species, or mammals, or birds, fish, and mammals.
Well, I think it's because the provision is specific to national wildlife refuges, which are not typically, it's not, those aren't typically in water. So they're more land-based with maybe some area around it, as opposed to, if you're talking migration, feeding and migration, those are for salmonids, say. It sounds like that's what you're talking about here, that those would be specific only to in water, but that's not the only provision that I think would apply. We've got guidance from some of those state documents that talks about impacts to critical habitat, and of course it has the list. If I could find that
Yeah, I
for
think
you.
that this verbiage comes out of Dr. Weston's 1986 report.
I'm sorry?
This comes, the 600 feet from any national wildlife refuge, it all comes from Dr. Weston's report.
Right, and there's more specificity in that, where it's got the list of the kinds of habitat specifically to include, or to avoid, like eelgrass, like kelp, like forage fish spawning and, spawning habitat. And those would all be issues to consider because of the provision that says you have to meet the recommended guidelines, the siting study, the use and conflicts document, and the EIS. So rather than repeating all those kinds of things within our code, we simply refer to them.
So that by number 9, avoiding the vegetative, submerged vegetation areas, and the 1,500 feet between those two things were out far enough in either case to not be in those pathways that the early salmonids are going through to head out to sea.